Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome again to another episode of A Pan-African View. Today, China is the biggest single investor in Africa. Between 2000 and 2018, there were more than 1,000 Chinese loans worth $152 billion extended to 49 African governments. This love affair is driven by Africa's need for fast economic transformation and China's insatiable appetite for commodities and global influence. While almost all African leaders have excitedly welcomed and praised China for extending their assistance and investments to Africa, there are many, especially the United States, who are convinced China has hidden designs on Africa. Some go as far as suggesting the massive investments China is plowing into Africa is deliberately intended to create a debt trap which could result in China taking over national assets that might have been offered as collateral. In today's episode, we take a dive into this love affair and try to establish if Chinese money in Africa is a win-win situation for both partners, or, as the West claims, a Chinese debt trap policy at play. China's early involvement in Africa was primarily centered on building ideological solidarity with other underdeveloped countries, as they were referred to then, to advance Chinese-style communism and to counter the West and Soviet Union's influence on the continent. China supported independent movements in Africa, providing not only moral and rhetorical support, but also weapons and military training. As you can see, China has been Africa's good friend for a long time. During these times of political alignment, Chinese economic aid was provided to Africa gratis, even though China was facing its own economic challenges. For the 2 decades, from the mid-50s to mid-70s, China gave about $2.5 billion to 36 African countries in aid and sent thousands of engineers, doctors, and technicians to provide assistance for African development and undertook various infrastructure projects. A project that stood out was the 1,860-kilometer-long Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which was financed and built by China, and upon its completion was hailed as a monument of China-Africa friendship. In the past 2 decades, China-Africa relationship has exploded in all aspects. By 2008, China had become the second largest trade partner, second only to the United States, and the largest individual country exporter to sub-Saharan Africa. Today, China-Africa trade is more than $100 billion annually, making China the biggest single investor in Africa. In almost every African country, China is financing and constructing more than one mega project, including high-rise buildings in the African capitals, railway lines, roads and bridges, mining, ports, airports, stadiums, real estate development, and many more. Of course, we cannot forget to mention China's gift to Africa, the African Union headquarters, the second tallest building in Addis Ababa. China's presence and influence is literally everywhere in Africa, including at the pinnacle of power, the African Union. Just to give us a glimpse of the impact of Chinese investments in Africa, let's look at their impact in a few countries. The flagship of China's Belt and Road project is Kenya's 290-mile railway from the port city of Mombasa to the capital, Nairobi, which opened to the public recently. Kenya borrowed more than $9.5 billion between 2006 and 2017, which makes it the third largest recipient of Chinese loans in Africa. It was reported in late December 2018 that Kenya may soon face default on Chinese loans to develop its largest and most lucrative port, the port of Mombasa. There are fears that this could force Kenya to relinquish control of the port to China. The Kenyan media has debated whether Chinese loans are worth the risk of falling into a debt trap, drawing analogies with Sri Lanka, where a national port is now owned by a Chinese company. Some commentators have argued that these loans could jeopardize Kenyan sovereignty. In Djibouti, China got its first overseas military base in exchange for major investments, among them a multi-purpose port connected to the Djibouti-Ethiopia railway terminal, preferential loans, a pipeline, and 2 airports. Today, Djibouti is at high risk of debt distress, with perhaps 2/3 of the country's debt being to China. At the start of 2019, analysts estimated Ethiopia had borrowed more than $12 billion from China, creating a huge debt burden. China has financed and built a 470-mile electric railway from Addis Ababa to a port in neighboring Djibouti. Chinese firms also built, funded, and are operating the $475 million light railway in Addis Ababa, an $86 million ring road, and a 6-lane highway. The light rail system is being operated and managed by Chinese and not Ethiopians. Let me hope that Ethiopians are being trained to take over the operations. The same situation is playing out in Kenya, where the China-funded Mombasa to Nairobi railway is also operated by Chinese. If you and I were in the negotiating team, we would have insisted that Africans be trained to operate the asset in the shortest possible time and not leave it to the Chinese. Jobs creation for citizens should be at the heart of every negotiation that Africa makes with any investor. In February 2019, Ethiopia's external debt stood at about $26 billion, and half of this was owed to China. As Ethiopia faced debt stress, Prime Minister Abiy told Parliament that his government had successfully renegotiated the restructuring of the repayment period for 60% of its external debt from 10 years to 30 years. Until the first quarter of 2019, Angola debt to China was estimated at almost $22 billion, representing almost 50% of the total debt. In 2015, Reuters reported that there were 50 Chinese state companies and 400 private Chinese businesses operating in Angola, but many Angolans are said to distrust their country's ties with China, in part because oil repayments for loans leave Rwanda with relatively little crude to sell on the world markets, which has led to the country's liquidity crisis and high inflation. Most Chinese loan repayments in Angola are linked to the price of oil at the time they are negotiated. When the price of oil on the world market fell drastically, Angola had to ship more crude to China to sustain the same value. This is the case in other African countries that swap commodities for investment. Every time the price of the commodity depreciates, a situation we have no control over, the country has to ship more. This goes to highlight the vulnerability of African countries whose economies are entirely dependent on a few commodities, and to underline the need to diversify the economies. In 2008, the RC government unveiled a package of Chinese investments totaling $9.3 billion. This money was for China to build massive new copper and cobalt mines, railways, roads, clinics, hospitals, schools, and 2 new universities. In exchange, China would get almost 11 million tons of copper and 620,000 tons of cobalt, which it would extract over 25 years. Also, the construction of the projects would be by Chinese construction companies, and the labor would involve thousands of Chinese workers doing what Congolese could do. Gilbert Malemba, a former law school dean in Lubumbashi, expressed concern regarding the Chinese loans when he said that the Chinese are not making use of Congolese talent. They hire laborers and that's it. Management and technical expertise are provided almost exclusively by Chinese workers. When they pack up and go, Congo will be left with nothing in terms of human resource development. Mr. Malemba couldn't have put it any better. As we seek foreign investments, value addition to our commodities and capacity building should be at the center of every negotiation between Africa and any partner. Zambia is experiencing debt stress due to Chinese loans. According to Africa Confidential, in 2018, due to debt-related issues, the national electricity company ZESCO entered into negotiations with a Chinese company for it to take over ZESCO. China also retains a highly contentious stake in Zambia's national broadcaster ZNBC. In 2017, Chinese media conglomerate Star Times funded the rollout of a migration to a new digital TV signal and now controls 60% of a joint digital venture with ZNBC. Just imagine a situation in which a foreign company owns controlling shares in a state-owned media house. This would mean China decides what we see and hear on our own national media. The Tanzanian head of state, John Magufuli, recently cancelled a $10 billion agreement signed by his predecessor with Chinese investors to construct a port in Bagamoyo just north of Dar es Salaam. The Chinese investors initially agreed with the then Tanzanian administration to build the said port on condition that they will be granted a 30 years guarantee and 99 years uninterrupted lease with an attached outrageous demand that the Tanzanian government will have absolutely no power to raise concerns on whoever invests in the port during the period stated. Really? Hard to believe, but it did happen. This was a clear case of a corrupt leadership selling off the country for a few coins of silver. President Magufuli must be commended for saving his country billions and showing that we are capable of rejecting investments that do not serve us well. Chinese money is not coming alone. The thousands of Chinese investment projects have resulted in an influx of hundreds of thousands of Chinese migrants into Africa. It is estimated that there are more than 1 million Chinese and the number is growing. Thousands are engaged in activities such as small shops, selling all sorts of cheap Chinese goods ranging from textiles, shoes, kitchenware, furniture, electronics, refrigerators, air conditioners, mobile phones, name it. Everything is available. In some capitals, whole streets have been taken over by Chinese-owned shops, including barber shops, while Chinese restaurants have now sprung up in every African capital. I am told in some capitals there are upscale brothels worked by Chinese prostitutes. Chinese farmers have been trickling into Africa for years, buying land and working it to produce rice and other food crops to support food security back in China. China's interest in agricultural investment in land is bound to generate problems as happened in Mozambique. In Africa, Land is at the heart of a nation's identity, and it is easy to raise emotions about outsiders when land is involved. Many Africans are intensely wary of Chinese immigration into Africa, especially if they are coming to take over huge chunks of fertile land. Land emotions aside, Chinese involvement in agriculture could make a big difference. Africa would greatly benefit from simple but effective Chinese technology like irrigation systems. Through investment and demonstration, Chinese farmers could serve as an important catalyst in an African economic takeoff. If we look at the above narration, it appears the Chinese loans are intended to help transform Africa as long as Africa knows what it wants and knows how to get it for the benefit of the country. Also, in most countries, the loans are manageable and are actually transforming the countries, and even where it appears countries might default, the possibility for restructuring the loans exists. So, where is the perception that China's investments are designed to drive Africa into a debt trap situation coming from? The China-Africa relationship is currently being interpreted through two opposed perceptions. The first is a xenophobic one, mostly adopted in the West. For example, at a policy briefing at the Heritage Foundation, the former United States National Security Advisor John Bolton criticized China's actions in Africa and claimed the continent had fallen victim to Beijing's new colonialism. China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands, Bolton said. The West goes on to claim that such predatory actions are part of broader Chinese strategic initiatives with the ultimate goal of advancing Chinese global dominance. Advancing Chinese global dominance. Isn't that what every power, including the United States, is doing and spending enormous resources to achieve it? Blaming China here is being utterly hypocritical. Many in Africa, especially those in the opposition parties, have a negative perception of Chinese loans. The Zambian politician Michael Sata, then in opposition, was one of them. In a paper presented to Harvard University in 2007, Sata stated that European colonial exploitation in comparison to Chinese exploitation appears benign, because even though the commercial exploitation was just as bad, the colonial agents also invested in social and economic infrastructure services. Chinese investment, on the other hand, is focused on taking out of Africa as much as can be taken out without any regard to the welfare of the local people. You cannot disagree with Sata here. Not long after this, Sata became the president and his perception of Chinese loans instantly disappeared. The second and opposing perception of the partnership between Beijing and Africa is a pro-China one. This is the view adopted mostly in Africa. According to the proponents of this narrative, China is a trustworthy ally of Africa. China is a country that does not have a history of colonial aspirations in Africa and is providing much needed funding without any strings attached. Moreover, China has a reputation among African countries for respecting other cultures. Hold on. Did I say that? Respecting other cultures? Considering the recent events in China involving the mistreatment of Africans during the coronavirus pandemic, I beg to withdraw the statement for now. At the September 2018 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation for SAC in Beijing, then African Union chairperson and Rwandan President Paul Kagame extolled the Chinese aid and investment strategy in Africa as a source of deep transformation. Kagame argued that the cooperation between China and Africa is based on mutual respect and is for the benefit of both partners. The key factor that determines the success of Chinese loans to Africa is whether or not African governments use such loans for productive capital investment. For these investments to succeed, African governments need to be accountable to the people of Africa, Kagame reiterated. I really like this man. We will return to President Kagame's statement shortly because of its substance. At the same meeting, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa summarized the African position on China's partnership by saying that, in the values that it promotes, in the manner that it operates, and in the impact that it has on African countries, FOSAC refutes the view that a new colonialism is taking hold in Africa, as our detractors would have us believe. Returning to President Kagame's statement, many would say, but Mr. President, that's exactly where the problem lies. How many African leaders are accountable to their people? How much of the loans actually goes to productive capital investment, especially if conditions such as good governance, transparency, and accountability in the management of the loans are totally lacking in China's credit policy? Isn't perhaps the absence of these conditions the reason why these loans are so appealing to Africa? We all know that poorly monitored funds breed corruption and allow politicians to siphon off a big chunk of the funds, forestalling national development. There are some obvious reasons that make China a preferred partner for Africa. The first is the unconditional loans and access to capital, quick delivery of services and cheap goods, and an alternative appealing development model. Secondly, well thought out, prudently negotiated, and properly executed loans can greatly bolster a country's economic and social development, and China is the leader in building high-quality infrastructure at lower cost than anyone else. Thirdly, China's history of fast and successful economic growth is a model from which many lessons could be learned in Africa. For instance, how China has lifted about 800 million people out of poverty through its untraditional path of development resonates with Africa. A major concern is that while Beijing is well positioned to help Africa improve its governance, it seems extremely reluctant to do so, when one of the reasons for China's impressive development trajectory has been good governance, a strong, efficient, and results-oriented public administration. But so far, Beijing has remained attached to its non-interference position. Critics point out that this sort of economic relationship that looks the other way encourages corruption and, judging by stories of extravagant wealth for those in charge of many of these African countries, it is not difficult to imagine where such wealth comes from. In the recent past, there have been hostilities and conflicts between Chinese and Africans, which could greatly jeopardize the China-Africa relations. Recently, there have been several cases of Chinese racism towards Africans in China as well as against locals. Reports of discrimination against Africans in China during the coronavirus outbreak sparked outrage among African communities around the world. Several African governments, including Nigeria, Uganda, and Ghana, summoned Chinese ambassadors in their countries to protest. Ambassadors from several African countries in China wrote to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs calling for the Chinese government to cease forceful testing, quarantine, and other inhuman treatment meted out to Africans. China's response has been to deny that any problem exists. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao responded by stressing that China treats all foreign nationals equally. Yet, as more and more videos of African mistreatment emerge, China's stance of innocence is harder to maintain. Right here in Africa, Chinese are being also accused of racist behavior towards Africans. Recently, a Chinese restaurant in Zambia's capital Lusaka was closed by the local authorities after allegedly denying entry to a local for being a foreigner. In Nigeria, calls for diplomatic action shifted into more vitriolic anger against Chinese nationals, and on social media, demands such as "deport racist Chinese" went viral. Very recently, an investigative journalist revealed that Kenyan workers at the Chinese-built railway were being subjected to repeated incidents of racial discrimination and abuse by their Chinese supervisors. Other allegations were that Chinese nationals were doing jobs that should have been done by Kenyans, and that highly qualified Kenyan staff were being assigned minor roles. Not much has been done by the government to help change the attitude of the Chinese, perhaps because the authorities are trying to trade carefully in their dealings with the Chinese. But they are doing it at the expense of the dignity of Kenyans, which is not acceptable, especially during this period of Black Lives Matter movement. Another critical concern is the competition of Chinese goods with African goods. Chinese-produced clothing and other items are dumped in Africa to compete with African products in the African market. As a result, the nascent African textile industry has suffered a steep decline, which has resulted in immense job losses. The influx of Chinese imports in Africa has raised concerns around the continent, since they undercut local manufactured products and crush local businesses. This situation, where we are becoming consumers of Chinese products at the expense of the development of our own industries, is not sustainable and certainly not desirable. We need jobs, and Chinese products don't create them. In concluding, China's emerging interest offers Africa opportunities in the form of investment capital and development assistance. On the other hand, it brings challenges in the form of competition and Chinese immigrants. Putting both opportunities and challenges on the balance, the opportunities outweigh the challenges considerably. Ultimately, Africa stands to gain from China's presence. While many would like to blame China for their aggressive drive to provide loans that might lead us into a debt trap, as President Kagame said, whether the loans will result in benefiting the country lies squarely with those negotiating on our behalf and the executors of the projects. There is need for citizens to demand complete transparency and accountability in the negotiations of the loans. In most cases, the public gets to know only when the loans go sour and the Chinese are knocking, demanding their pound of flesh. Simon Kapwepwe, Zambia's vice president in 1967, said, "If we don't handle our independence well, colonizers will come back in form of investors. If we are not vigilant, Kapwepwe's words will come to haunt us." As I sign off, let's keep in mind that the effectiveness of these China loans is entirely dependent on us. As we say in Swahili, asante na kwaheri. Your host, Gerald Mpisi.